Now, Emma, we actually spoke, didn't we, just over a year ago in December 2022. That was before any doctors' strikes had actually been called. And junior doctors are currently striking for 6 days. We're recording on the second day of the strike. And as I mentioned earlier, that's the longest in NHS history. And it comes after an accrued 28 days of stoppage over the last year. There's been multiple periods of strike action by junior doctors and consultants as well in England since we last spoke. What's changed since we last spoke, and what hasn't? Why has this been ongoing?
Well, in some ways, lots has changed. We've shifted the government from a position of no negotiations at all, no discussions about pay, to a place where they have given 8.8% on average to junior doctors and 6% to most other groups of doctors, and now has put further offers on the table for consultants and SAS doctors, and they have offered 3% additionally to junior doctors, but that's an average again. So for most doctors, still a real terms pay cut. In some ways, there's been very little change. They still have quite unusual positions. So, for example, they refuse to talk whilst we have strike dates announced or whilst there is strike action on the table. They still go onto the media and call us childish or unreasonable. They still insist that we doctors are the people who are responsible for patient safety concerns. They still have no understanding of the drivers of the doctor exodus from the country. We still have a workforce crisis in the NHS. We still have growing waiting lists. We still have problems in our A&Es seeing people when they urgently need assessment and help. We still have a collapsing health service. And I was really hopeful that, a year on, more than a year on, into this dispute, we would have resolved it and be in the process of rebuilding. But actually what's happened is that in the last year, more than 8,600 doctors have applied to the GMC for a certificate of good medical standing to leave the country to work as a doctor abroad. Leaving the NHS to work abroad has overtaken retirement as the reason for leaving the NHS.
Wow.
And we are still in utter crisis. So some things have changed. The government position has definitely moved as a result of strike action, but unfortunately, many things are just as bad as they were.
Right. Okay. And because you mentioned the pay increases that the government has offered. Let's start by talking about that. Why isn't that enough? I can think of a number of different workers that I've interviewed over this sort of era of industrial action who would have been quite pleased with that settlement.
The dispute that we are having is about pay restoration. Junior doctors have faced now 15 years of real terms pay cuts year on year, amounting to about 26% less pay than we would have had if we were practicing in 2008. The work is not 26% easier, and there aren't 26% fewer patients. In fact, demand is much higher. Our range of treatments is much better and therefore more complicated. We have an older population with lots more what we call multi-morbid conditions, so lots of different health problems, often competing priorities with each other. So the work is harder. And then in the last few years, obviously, we've had a pandemic during which, many of our colleagues literally died. And indeed, many of us have become unwell from that, either physically from repeated infections with coronavirus or mentally because of the trauma that we experienced through that period. And then we've had a massive period of large inflation, which has further cut into our pay packets and the spending power that we have. So when you then offer, 8.8% on average for many doctors, it's less than that, or 6% for consultants and SAS doctors, that's another real terms pay cut on top of 26% that we had already faced. It's really, really difficult to stomach, and it doesn't go anywhere near reversing the crisis that we have precipitated in the NHS by pushing doctors out of the country and indeed into other industries. if we want a service that is going to give good care to patients, the kind of care that we trained to provide, the kind of care that I want to give, I personally want to give patients, we need more staff. And if we keep losing staff who are our friends and colleagues to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Ireland, we are condemning ourselves, those of us who stay behind here working in the NHS, to providing shoddy care, increasingly shoddy care to patients for our entire careers. I'm not yet 30. I hope to be working in the NHS, well into my 60s. And I want it to be good. I look after patients who are mentally unwell, sometimes so mentally unwell they don't they need treatment. That's not the kind of service, it's not the kind of care that you can easily give in the private sector, because people don't present themselves for care. So I really need our free at the point of use service to be functional and to be a good place to work. So the offers that the government are putting forward do not come close to fixing those problems for us. And we'll keep fighting until we get something that looks like a fix, because it's so important that we are able to keep a good care service running.
Right, and those accumulated real terms pay cuts that you laid out, they add up sort of roughly to the 35% that you are demanding, if our listeners hadn't heard that. It's interesting because doctors in Scotland haven't been on strike and they accepted a 12% pay rise from the Scottish government. Is that something that could be comparable to something that doctors in England could accept, or do you see that as a sort of different playing field altogether?
The Scottish offer is really interesting. The Scottish deal is really interesting. So in Scotland, they called for strike action and the Scottish government negotiated. And they put forward an offer which had some backdated elements to it, and then an in-year pay rise. So the pay increase was approximately 17.5%, plus a commitment for 3 years of above inflation pay awards, i.e. no further pay cuts, and indeed that's designed to step towards, over time, pay restoration, to restore that pay that we've lost over the last several years, and a commitment to reform elements of the contract that make working in Scotland pretty intolerable. And they still have a contract from 2002, with fewer hours protections and safety changes than we have in England. So the offer in Scotland was thought to be credible and put to members and accepted by a large majority of members. In England, the Westminster government doesn't have the constitutional length to offer a deal which requires, negotiations every year to have pay awards above inflation. And indeed, they've told us that they wouldn't be prepared to consider such an arrangement. But we would be willing to accept and to put to members a whole variety of creative solutions that put us on the road to pay restoration. And indeed, we made reasonable progress ahead of Christmas, ahead of the December strike action, in discussing a variety of options to begin to restore doctors' pay. Unfortunately, they declined to put any of those offers to us, to our members, stating instead that they would only put, an average of 3% into pay directly, which is just not sufficient for all of the reasons I've just described.
Yeah. And let's talk a bit about the politics of this. I know you're not on the Junior Doctors Committee sort of in the negotiations yourself personally, but you will know more about what's going on behind the scenes than I do. Has it made much of a difference that Victoria Atkins replaced Stephen Barclay as Health Secretary in the reshuffle last November?
Well, I certainly think there's been a change in attitude. Victoria Atkins has made lots of positive noises about wanting to make a deal with junior doctors. She is less competitive than Steve Barclay was, but functionally, that has led us to only another 3% offer. And she, despite having a further offer that she tells the media she has to give us, declines to give it to us. So, in some ways, yes, but, in some ways it's just window dressing. The fundamental issues have not changed. What's really interesting is that we are now also discovering, just the politics is interesting, that although we've had positive negotiations and a deal made in Scotland, we are soon to have strike action also in Wales. So from the 15th of January, we have strike action under the Labour administration there. Wes Streeting's position has also changed quite substantially since I last spoke to you. He now says that pay restoration would be a journey under a Westminster Labour government, which of course we're happy to hear. So there's quite a lot of shifting ground on the side of the politicians. What's not changed is that we need to restore doctors' pay, to keep doctors in the country, to fix the workforce crisis in the NHS, and to build a service that really the public of England and the wider UK deserve to have.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I wonder if you think doctors are sort of treated differently by the government than other workers, because over the past couple of years, 2022, 2023, we've covered on this podcast a lot of different strikes: nurses, ambulance workers, midwives, but also, other sectors, railway workers, the postal service, teachers, barristers. Obviously, there are other strikes down the line. I think we're facing tube strikes in London as I'm recording. But why is it taking so long to find a settlement, in particular for doctors, do you think? Do you think the government sees you differently? Do you think they assume that the public assumes that you're sort of already well enough paid, despite all of the detail you've taken me through on the real terms pay cuts?
I think it's certainly true that there's a lot of misapprehension about what doctors are paid, particularly junior doctors. I regularly find people, even now, 14 months into our dispute, that are surprised that junior doctors can be paid now as little as £15.53 an hour. At the beginning of this dispute, it was £14.08 an hour, and we met people who just did not believe us. Just straight up did not believe that could possibly be true, including our own colleagues in the health service who would say, hang on, I thought doctors were loaded. Just a complete disconnect from the reality. So I think there's certainly that to rely on if you are planning to increase pay for a group of public sector workers. The government can, to some extent, rely on the idea that medicine is well paid, that doctors are well paid. And you see it when they do the comparisons, and indeed Wes Streeting's done this as well, where they say, oh, well, doctors are not my first priority. I care about people who are lower paid than doctors, for example. And then they give a range of other people, particularly in the health service, but also in other areas of government. Of course, we think all of those people deserve fair pay. None of us deserve real terms pay cuts. None of us caused the crisis in 2008 that led to austerity and real terms pay cuts across the public sector. So there definitely is that. There's also another difference. So when negotiating with doctors, the government are only negotiating with doctors. We have a different contractual and pay structure to the rest of NHS workers that we only share with dentists, who are quite a small group. So pay awards or contractual change that affects doctors only affects the relatively small number of us that there are in England, between 70 and 80,000 junior doctors. So it's not a huge group compared to those NHS staff. Basically everybody else shares a pay and contractual structure called Agenda for Change, which is millions of staff. So that means that we don't cost as much to have pay increases or contractual change for, and any agreements that are made with us are relatively well contained, in a way that they aren't if you are making agreements with, for example, nurses. So I think that's another difference.
That's interesting. And I mean, just lastly, some of the talk over my Christmas break was people expressing fears about the junior doctors going on strike for 6 days, which is the longest time that it's happened, but also over this period, which we know is when the NHS is under the most pressure. Someone I know who was due to give birth was worried about the implications for her. Another relative who has had this terrible cough for a long time and has been waiting and having her appointment deferred with a respiratory team. There was a lot of worry about this, and NHS chiefs have expressed fears for patient safety. What's your union doing to make sure that it mitigates those risks?
Yeah, so doctors, unlike other groups of NHS staff, have a kind of inbuilt cover system from consultants and SAS doctors who remain in work, and the vast majority of hospitals manage to plan really well for periods of industrial action. Things are disrupted for sure, so clinics, elective surgeries and things won't go ahead. But urgent emergency and critical care is covered by those consultants and SAS doctors. Sometimes those cover arrangements will fall through, and we have a process called derogation, where trusts can flag that to NHS England, and we receive those requests and can send junior doctors back to work in cases where cover arrangements have collapsed, normally due to illness. And then, of course, we also respond often very quickly to major disasters or mass casualty events. And in many of those cases, the requirement for junior doctors has evaporated when the true extent of the situation has become known. So, for example, when there has been capsized boats in the Channel, we have set people up to be derogated along the south coast in case there were mass casualties. And when it's become known that isn't required, we then alert those doctors that they can remain on strike. So we have a kind of regular meet-up system with NHS England and that derogation process that makes sure that we can maintain patient safety throughout the strike.
Right, okay. Well, thanks so much for filling us in on the strikes, and we'll be watching closely to see how they play out, and perhaps we'll have you back. Thanks for joining us again, Emma.
Thanks, Anoosh.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.